Hey, everybody, and welcome to the final installment in our series with the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, where we've been dissecting extremism, figuring out the ways to combat it. And here we have our panel of experts here. You have met all of them so far, and if you haven't, go back and make sure to watch all of them. We have William Alcorn, Natalie James, Mario Poica, Sean Abernathy, and Ashton Kingdon. And I have we'll have all their bios in the YouTube description, and you can go in there and read more about all their work and see some of the past interviews we've done because they've been pretty awesome. So how's everybody doing? Doing great?
Hey,
Great.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is super exciting. So I'm glad to get everyone in one room. We can all get to discussing here. I just want to start off by hitting everyone with a lightning round. So what we're going to do is ask you, if you were in a national security meeting with President Biden right now, and he turns over to you in the seat and says, hey, Jack, what word of advice would you give me? The number one piece of advice that you would give Biden on countering extremism, what would it be? We'll start with Natalie.
Okay, mine would be definitely latching on from the conversation that you and I had in our interview, the investment in education, providing the space, the time and the resource for educators to have the opportunities and the know-how to engage in critical debate, media literacy and critical thinking skills is paramount for me.
Awesome. We'll go to Mario next.
Oh, okay. My main focus would probably be that we have to start by understanding the complexity and the diversity of far-right extremism, which includes different drivers, different goals, different grievances, different motives. And without understanding those differences, we won't be able to find good ways to prevent. And prevention is obviously the number one sort of approach, but also we wouldn't find effective ways to intervene in any other way or develop disengagement projects.
Okay, speaking of prevent, Sean, you're next.
I mean, I think my legs would turn to jelly, to be honest with you. But I would say, Mr. President, read the prevent duty. But also, I think a partnership approach is key. That will be my biggest takeaway, really. This isn't a problem that we can arrest our way out of, and that we should take on board the expertise of multi-agency partners who work in education, as Natalie says, in health and prisons, probation, you name it, but as many experts in the room as we can gather and take on board their advice and expertise and have a whole society partnership approach to solving these issues.
Awesome. Ashton, what about you?
I would say, Biden, you need to think really carefully about the impact posed by emerging technologies on extremism, and think about regulating this technology now before it's too late and gets rolled out.
Awesome. William?
I guess my bit of advice would be to focus on fringe actors as well as networks instead of groups. I think they've become really key. There's some groups that only exist on Telegram channels, really. I'd also kind of suggest that this kind of division between domestic and foreign isn't very meaningful when it comes to the transnational far right, and that that slightly complicates things. So that's your homework, Mr. Biden.
Yeah, and I think obviously the difference between domestic and transnational is really, really important. And actually, speaking of that, Biden went ahead, and I can just dive into this next part because he essentially yesterday declaratively said during his Tulsa speech that white supremacy is the greatest threat to the homeland, lethal threat, greater than ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and he caused a firestorm across the right-wing media and social media. One of my tweets currently is getting bombarded by trolls because I quoted him on that. So it seems he's actually taking that seriously. So speaking of that, and it seems that there's going to be a new DHS approach to this, and now that they're prioritizing white supremacy, I did want to jump into one of the things that we discussed. William, you and I, we kind of dove in early on this, and I was really interested in having a broader conversation about this specifically. But when it comes to combating the white supremacist terrorism, what do you think? I'll start with you, William, and then we can kind of bounce around. What do you think the merits are of a domestic terrorism statute? And I know you were advocating for one. That's why I wanted to start with you and then kind of get everyone's perspectives on it, because I know there's a wide-ranging opinion set on this. So what are your thoughts on the case for that?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Ahmed. I mean, I think it would help to kind of identify in a bit more detail some of the actors that we're talking about. I know that in policy circles, far actors in the US have been talked about as racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists. But I think definitions is quite important. As Mario was saying, you have quite a spread of different ideologies and different grievances, and some will radicalize towards non-violent forms of activism, whereas others will tend to, at the fringe ends, tend to kind of a kind of a percentage will be radicalized towards the more violent end of things. So I think it's an important debate that needs to be had. I know that there's probably especially concerns around how that can be used. Obviously, freedom of speech, First Amendment type concerns are quite key in the US context, as well as how it can be used against different actors who aren't on the far right of the spectrum as well.
Yeah, because we discussed that during our conversation about how there's a potential for it to be weaponized against, like, let's say, Black Lives Matter in the future. If God forbids President Trump gets in there, or we have a President DeSantis, and let's say Biden were to do a domestic terrorism statute, suddenly they're weaponizing it against Black Lives Matter. And on that point, I think that that's a good place to go to Sean on that, because given prevents essential the past to prevent, and given the potential for certain demographics to be stigmatized, etc. And what are your thoughts on this domestic terrorism potential statute?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I said earlier that we can't arrest our way out of this problem, and neither can we legislate our way out of it either, I don't think. That said, in the UK, I would say that the prevent duty has had some success by being placed on a statutory footing. But we need to bear in mind that it's important to be risk and threat agnostic in many ways. So right-wing extremism, for instance, is the fastest growing terrorist threat in the UK. I think right-wing terrorist investigations have almost doubled in recent years. And so whatever legislation comes into place needs to be very carefully thought through. And I agree with the point about it potentially being weaponized in the future, but it should also be responsive to emerging risks and threats. And we've certainly seen in the UK a number of right-wing extremist groups, for instance, that have been prescribed and banned by the Home Office in recent years. So I do think there's a place for it. I really do, but I think that it needs to be very carefully thought through and considered.
For sure. And Natalie, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I think it comes back to something that Mario was saying before about greater recognition and just awareness and knowledge about what this threat is, what the ideologies are, the differences, the divergences between them, because you potentially face a kind of a carte blanche umbrella piece of legislation that tries to get everybody, and in doing so then has the potential, as you say, to then be utilized against kind of legitimate groups, but also the potential danger of when it could, on either side of the spectrum, it's either not specific enough or it's far too specific, that you then end up in a situation where legally it might be easier to get someone on, say, murder charges, because we've seen that in the UK in a couple of instances where the ideological aspect of it hasn't been strong enough to demonstrate a case for terrorism, but it certainly has been far easier to ensure that a perpetrator of a crime was got on kind of manslaughter or murder charges, sorry, in order to ensure that that person then was entered into the criminal justice system and received punishment for their actions. And there's a potential kind of slippy ground there where you can kind of understand why the legal system would want someone punished for the crimes that they've committed, rightly so. But if the kind of the threshold isn't quite there, and whether that be because of, you know, the evidence available, or it be because of faults in the legislation, in the statutes themselves, that's kind of another tricky ground for them to then play with as well.
No, yeah, those are definitely good points. Mario and Ashton, do either of you have anything do you want to add on that?
I mean, I think from the tech side, definitely having more of an emphasis placed on homegrown domestic terrorism from the far right would have a huge impact on the way that sort of artificial intelligence is deployed in terms of content takedown. The sooner we move away from the kind of radicalized Muslim other framework that so much AI looks for online, I think that that's definitely going to help combat the problem. But as the others were saying, this brings up these whole issues, doesn't it, about freedom of speech and, you know, what you're allowed to say and what you're not. And I think unless that changes sort of through policy, you're still going to get those sorts of people manifesting in online spaces.
Exactly.
Just a very quick comment. I agree with everything that you've said. I think obviously it has to be a multifaceted approach to intervention and prevention. The risk when we put too much emphasis or a lot of emphasis on those kind of government-led legal intervention, banning or other things, that it can backfire, because especially during the pandemic and the response from government has become the primary enemy for many. So if it comes from the primary enemy, then there's a risk involved that it actually amplifies the problem rather than mitigates the issue. And there are massive ramifications of such harsh intervention programs that may look good in the first instance, but then has really very negative implications in the long run. So we have to keep that in mind. The government is not the most trusted and most actor in this space anymore. I mean, less than ever probably.
Exactly right, because I mean, essentially, a lot of the central figure, the dark figure of these conspiracy theories and of these extremist movements, ideologies, is the government. So if the government now says we're gonna come and crack down, and like what I was telling Natalie the other day, you know, you can't bring a government official in to say, all right, sit someone down and say we're both gonna now de-radicalize you, because that won't work. So I think this topic actually ties into one of our questions we got from one of our followers. Her name is Pat, and she was asking about the differences between hate speech and free speech, and the opinions that some of you all had on that, because obviously, if there were to be a domestic terrorism statute, which I have mixed feelings on personally, we won't get into that. I just think the fact that there is such a thin line between that, especially on social media, and we could start with Ashton on that. What do you think, given in what you've seen on these online platforms, is the difference between free speech and hate speech when it comes to potentially regulating it, or when social media sites take this kind of speech down?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important thing to consider, particularly as alt tech platforms have flourished so much in this kind of, we are here for freedom of speech, and because you cannot say what you want to on mainstream social media platforms. And then there's all the difficulties because they've become decentralized social media networks now, trying to then get them to take the content down themselves. But definitely the platforms that I've been on bypass anything about freedom of speech, because the content is so horrific on there. They don't care what they're saying. And that's the reason they go there, right? Because even on the alt tech platforms, those kind of narratives and rhetoric are not allowed to be spoken on a public platform, which is why they kind of loiter there. And I think it's a really thin line between, and this comes back to the sort of wider issues of people that work on definitions of extremism. what you might find extreme, someone else might not find extreme. They might find mainstream. And because these borders are so fuzzy, I think when it comes to taking this down, particularly on platforms like Gab, that's going to be something that's really difficult. And you have these kind of clauses in place to protect the right to freedom of speech, which makes it incredibly more difficult to take that down. And until we have some sort of consensus, I think, about what's appropriate and what's not on a platform, which no one can agree on. The big Silicon Valley platforms can't agree, niche platforms can't agree. I think it's always going to be that really border fuzzy line between what you consider to be extreme and what someone else considers to be just expressing an opinion.
Exactly. And I also think when it comes to the counter-extremism aspect of, let's say you're trying to identify someone who poses a risk, like, Sean, and prevent, when you have, if someone's, you don't want to, especially here in the US, if someone's just going around and exerting their free speech, and it might be semi-extreme, but not, posing risks of violence yet, it's difficult to be able to target them, especially under a domestic terrorism like statute, because they might just be expressing their speech. So do you think that Sean, that there's that the line to hate speech is when it comes to when you're advocating violence, or is it one where someone's expressing just hateful views, like a lot of what Ashton sees, but they also, of course, preach a lot of violence on some of these platforms Ashton's on. Do you think the line should be acts of violence, or should people start to be alerted of, let's say, if we were to do a prevent-like system, when people just start initially espousing really dark, hateful views?
That's a great question. And I think in terms of prevent in the UK, the red line really would be violence or inciting, inspiring, glorifying violence. I remember one young man that we worked with for about 18 months, and he had some pretty abhorrent, extremely racist views, and it was a real challenge to sit down and talk with him, to go through them. But we kind of felt that we had to do it, and we made such good progress with him. And it struck me that one of the things he ended up telling us afterwards was that everybody else used to dismiss him as a Nazi. And he thought that, well, I'm not a Nazi. You may disagree with me, but I don't necessarily support that particular ideology. But he got himself into the mindset whereby if people keep calling me a Nazi, then I'll show them how much of a Nazi I can be. And it was almost, then it fueled his radicalization even further. And what he said was that the people that worked with him in Prevent were the first that actually sat down with him and genuinely unpicked his views and had open debate and discussion, because, open debate and critical thinking can actually be a really powerful tool when it comes to preventing extremist narratives from taking hold. So I get the difficulties around how we broach this, because I'm sure we can all agree that freedom of speech is a cornerstone of any democratic society, but we do need to be mindful when that can become hate speech. Does free speech mean that we should be able to say anything regardless of the consequences? Can we harass people? Can we intimidate people? And whilst it may not meet the threshold for, a Prevent referral, for instance, I think it's worth noting that in the UK, there is, legislation in terms of things like public order offences, whereby it can be an offence to use threatening, abusive or hateful language if the intent is to intimidate, harass or distress other people. So there is an element of hate speech covered in UK legislation, but generally my go-to position is that open debate and critical thinking are more productive ways forward when it comes to engaging with people who have hateful views. And I wouldn't like to see any suppression really of freedom of speech.
Speaking of critical thinking, Natalie, we talked a lot about this in the last interview we had about the role of education when it comes to kind of hate speech and free speech and those factors. I know in the US we hold those dear, and every time there's even a minor infringement on that, it raises a lot of alarms. Do you think that there's a route where it's less about kind of tamping down on that, and you think it might be more on, you seem to really think education is the key to a lot of preventing a lot of this. Do you think education would have a role in kind of preventing kids from even thinking about going down that speech path? And also just your overall thoughts on the hate speech, free speech debate.
Yeah, so I wrote a paper last year, early this year, with a colleague. We used his data for it, again looking at the prevent duty in education settings, and this was one of the things that came up that actually was really, really difficult for educators to deal with. And it was because of that blurred line between, okay, at what point does kind of hatred and hate crimes and become kind of extremism, and even further back from that, at what point does racism come into this as well? Because that was a really key aspect of narratives that were associated with the far right. But and as much as we might all hate racism when it occurs, racism does not always equate to the far right. It isn't indicative of far right ideologies. It isn't the be all and end all of them. You can be a racist without being a far right kind of supporter or advocate. Of course racism feeds into it massively, but it's not the kind of the be all and the end all of the ideology. And for a lot of educators, it was really difficult to know where that line crossed, and at what point someone who was espousing clearly racist views and potentially doing so at the detriment of their peers within their classroom, whether they were doing it in a public setting or within a private setting, that was something that they knew that they had to deal with because of the legislation that exists within the UK education system anyway. It prevents we have a huge focus on equality and diversity, and a massive clampdown on hate crime where it occurs, and misogyny feeds into that as well. So not just racism, but we see these different facets of hate crime. But the difficulty for people to be able to identify where that was something where someone needed to be picked up and go, hang on a minute, that's problematic, that is considered hate speech, and here's why, and have that direct conversation, which the vast majority of educators would feel comfortable to do because of the training that they receive. But actually being able to identify where that had the potential to slip into some of these far right narratives was incredibly difficult. And for the vast majority of participants that were in the research that my colleague conducted, that we wrote this paper on, they just didn't know where that line sat. And that's the difficulty where I think the knowledge about the ideology that Mario was talking about is really crucial here, not necessarily from educators themselves, but from people who they could then go to advise on these subjects. That at what point are we able to just have that conversation, and at what point do we need to bring in someone else to say, hang on a minute, is this racist, this misogynist idea, is it part of a bigger issue? Is it feeding into a bigger problem that perhaps we do need to take advice on? So they're positioned really well to deal with some of these issues, and 9 times out of 10, ask any educationalist, they would want to deal with that and they would feel happy to deal with that. Whether or not they're able to when it has the potential to stretch into these ideologies or is already doing so is another matter.
For sure. We'll go to you next, Mario, and then we'll go to William.
It's a very tricky debate about hate speech and free speech. I think it's important because hate speech is sort of on the continuum into the themes that we are talking about. It's not, as Natalie said, it's not racism is an equivalent with, like, equal to far right extremism, but there's free speech, there's hate speech, there's violent talk, and there's violent action. It's a very blurry continuum. And so hate speech for me is something that can't be outlawed, really. First of all, there are different national understandings. In the US, you have a different idea of what hate speech includes, because it would be incitement to hatred or incitement to violence or to act. It's very different in Germany, in Australia, and other places where showing a swastika is already considered hate speech and is outlawed. So it's hard to do that when there are different legal systems, but also different sort of social norms behind it, which is a reflection of the legal system, obviously, often. For me, it's important to understand what this hate stands for, what's behind it, as we said before, and as Sean also mentioned. And if you just tell people you can't say that, that's pretty useless in that process. But on the other hand, we don't want to provide a platform to amplify it. So finding a balance between both things, understanding where it comes from. Some far-right extremists are not very hateful. They're actually quite positive in their thinking, and they say, I have nothing against, you know, people of color or whatever, as long as they don't come into my space. White separatists, for example, they are fine with that. So we have to understand where the hatefulness comes from, what's behind it, what grievances sit there, or what goals sits behind this, and then we have to tackle that one by one. And otherwise, we have to understand that hate is obviously normalizing a certain kind of climate in certain online spaces, as Ashton said before, that can not only be an echo chamber, but amplify and aggravate certain norms and make them and normalize certain norms of hatefulness and division. But that's hard to get in there and outlaw that, because there's no way you can say you're not allowed to hate someone. Or, you know,
It's true.
Tricky.
Yeah. And William, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's a really complex issue, especially because it's so contextually specific. It's very hard to then come up with overarching principles and rules. A couple of years back, I wrote a paper for Europe Now. I think it's available online still, comparing free speech defences by different far-right actors. And what's one of the interesting things, I guess, if you think of the more kind of alt-right, post-Gamergate kind of cultures, is that they deliberately kind of bait people with their speech acts to kind of overreact and kind of it's called some other things, but or shit posting, but basically trying to make people kind of overreact to their to what they're saying online. So it's very hard to know the intent behind some of the things that people are posting. And there's also an element amongst far actors of trying to tread the line of plausible deniability, and not trying to overstep the mark. So they might use a more coded form of language in order to try and get around laws around kind of racial hatred or hate speech. So yeah, I'm trying to think back to the the paper that I wrote, but I think that's basically the two kind of key findings was around kind of presenting things in order to get an overreaction from other people, but also kind of hiding behind it. People use a term in scholarship called illiberal liberalism. So they use the language of like gender rights, freedom of speech, in order to kind of sound progressive, but obviously the end of this these speech acts is in order to other minorities, whether that's Muslims, to cast them as being kind of regressive and non-Western, or kind of defining what the out group is. So I hope that it's a bit of clarity.
No, those are good points, especially the two things there stood out to me. I mean, first of all, the illiberal liberalism is a great way to put it, especially given the right has really championed rights being infringed upon to justify their extremism and radicalism, especially Tucker Carlson lately. You guys know how I feel about Tucker Carlson. He's been just hitting that. And I think there's also another aspect of that, the intention. You don't know the intention of the speech. So that's kind of harder to, for a social media platform even to handle. Like, how do you know if someone is just baiting people, or if someone's serious, if someone's truly hateful, or if they're just attacking this person because they want a reaction, which is what my notifications are personally filled with, I think. On that note, this goes to another great question that comes from one of our followers that went into our replies and asked, can media outlets be regulated in a way that prevents extremism and conspiracy thinking from going mainstream? What can be done? We've already now kind of defined the way we see free speech versus hate speech generally, and domestic terrorism statutes, but when it comes to regulating media and social media as well, there's just a great number of challenges. I mean, there's Section 230 that can be amended on the tech end. And then there's also, as we've talked about multiple episodes so far, just the challenges of regulating media generally, when there's also the First Amendment. There's all these rights protecting specific entities. And, you know, when you have Fox News and OAN and Newsmax kind of doing what they're doing, are there any, if anyone want to flash their mics on this, I'll hop on this first, feel free. But I think it's a really good, important topic to dive into, of exactly how anyone thinks we might be able to target maybe media and social media regulation wise. Off the top, probably just going to go to Ashton first on this, just given your focus on tech and just media generally, and the kind of the speeches going on in online spaces. When you think of potential regulations, do you think that this is an issue that regulation can handle, or is it more like you say, like you said in our interview, that we're kind of trying to do technical solutions to a more human problem?
Yeah, I think the media, for me, I don't think that's possible, but I'm a very negative person when it comes to the media's influence on things. I think it's impossible to regulate. I think that you have this argument with people like Jordan Peterson. Why can't you just take Jordan Peterson? He appeals to so many people. And you see this with these kind of, you know, reactionary speakers that take the stage on talks and stuff, and how much attention they pull in. And I think that the media companies aren't going to want their ratings to drop by getting rid of those certain people. So I think, and this comes back to who you define as extreme and how other people feel if they're extreme or not. So Jordan Peterson is the classic argument I have. I have never been able to deliver a lecture on the alt-right and mention the intellectual dark web without having someone in the audience question me afterwards about Jordan Peterson and, oh, why are you saying this about Jordan Peterson? There's nothing wrong with him. He's really helped me grow as a person. And I think regulating tech is very similar. I think, as you said, I'm not a big fan of just deploying artificial intelligence to try and fix something that's a human generated problem and going on in society. So unfortunately, I'm very negative on the whole regulating front, particularly as no one can agree. As you said, there's different clauses in America that there are to the UK. So it makes content extremely difficult to take down. We see this when we try and regulate cybercrime, which is obviously borderless, transnational, with different countries having different policies and no one being able to agree. And then you get these kind of big emerging technologies that can give nation states so much power. Would they really want to compromise and give the same kind of power to countries in the global south, say, as they can for themselves? And I think that these issues of power and technology make it really difficult to try and regulate this as a problem.
Yeah, I completely agree. And just on my take on it, I'll deliver this quickly. If anyone wants to flash their mics and jump in on that, let me know. And then what I think is really, it's especially in the media, I think there are some things on the media end that I think are possible in the US, especially on the licensing front when it comes to Newsmax, OAN specifically. Fox News is mixed. Their opinion hosts are their opinion hosts. Tucker Carlson. But there are ways where you can, I think, make penalties like we've discussed. If you have multiple successful libel suits in the billions of dollars for, let's say, I don't know, lying about Dominion voting, maybe you should lose your license. And you should not be put in cable packages that I currently pay for, right? Why are you included in these cable packages that you don't have an obligation? That's a private entity, right? And I know that there's movements in the US that are trying to pressure these cable entities to try to debundle some of these and make it more of a choice. Like, I think there's some things on that end where if there's the kind of threat of more action being taken, people will kind of start to pull their people back. Like now on Newsmax, anytime the word like Smartmatic was mentioned or Dominion, the anchor will freak out because they don't want to be roped in, have their name in a lawsuit. So I think there's things on that end, but I won't go on too long. I'll pass over to William. I saw you wanted to mention something.
Yeah, I'll just say something quickly. I think Sean was also wanting to add. I think it's an interesting moment because in the UK we have an online harms bill. In Germany, there was a law which has been, I think, around for a couple of years around how quickly social media companies need to react to content that needs to be taken down. I think one of the difficulties is that big online platforms are very set up in terms of capacity to doing this, but smaller platforms will find it a lot harder to react to this. They don't have the same capacity. So this is something that one of CARR's partners, Tech Against Terrorism, has been trying to kind of assist with and being a bit of a critical voice on, because it's all well having these laws, but if you're a smaller company, it's very hard to really scale things as much as the big companies. So there might be extra kind of practical difficulties around that, but I certainly think it's the way to go in terms of kind of making sure that these company reacts. I mean, as long as they're not kind of, that doesn't force them into a reactive mode forever, because obviously they have to think about how they strategize around this. But yeah, that's what I wanted to add. I'll give way to Sean.
For sure, yeah. So over to Sean, and then Mario, I saw you flashing too. So we'll go to Sean first.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, normally I'm super optimistic about most things, but on this one, I think I'm going to share a little of Ashton's negativity.
Doom and gloom.
Yeah, I know. It really goes against my moral fiber, but I do agreeing with you. No, I think if there was one, I often think if there was one thing I could change, it would be to have a more responsible media. And whilst I appreciate that the freedom of the press is ever so important, and that there may well be a role for regulation, it's just so difficult to achieve. I mean, I don't want to harp on about prevent all the time, but we've certainly felt a wee bit victimized by the press in the UK in recent years because of some of the negative case studies and controversies that have surrounded the prevent duty. And knowing sort of the insider detail that I would about a lot of those cases, I can say that many of them are completely exaggerated and in some case untrue. So I would read a lot of even mainstream articles and be tearing my hair out thinking at how wrongly prevent, for instance, is being portrayed. But that's really small fry when you compare that to how, you know, British Muslim communities feel that they're treated by the media in the UK. You just have to look at the newspapers every time there's a terrorist attack, and I can guarantee you it'll often be reported differently depending on the skin color of the perpetrator. And so I know for a fact that many of our local communities here in the UK definitely feel that they get a hard time in terms of their representation in the media. I think it took the murder of Joe Cox, Member of Parliament here in the UK, I think in 2016, for a lot of mainstream media outlets to really sit up and take notice of the fact that right-wing extremism is actually a big issue for us. So I do think it's something that's difficult to tackle, and I don't think we can regulate our way out of it. But at the same time, the advice that I would have to anybody is that this is where the critical thinking element really comes to the fore. This is why it's so important that in our schools and education system that young people are given the skills to be able to assess information for themselves and to look for information from credible sources. And we've certainly had success in that respect with prevent referrals, for instance. But the best piece of advice that I ever had in respect of this, and I hate to admit it, it came from my daughter when she was 5 years old, and she's 10 now, so it's some time ago, but she saw me on my phone in the kitchen once and asked me what I was doing, and I said, oh, I'm just checking the news. And quick as lightning, she said, well, make sure you check it from 3 different places before you decide. And I thought, that's, you know, unbelievable. I thought for a moment she was a genius.
Might be. But
She might be. I'm still keeping my fingers crossed on that one. But actually, at school, primary school, they had what they called e-cadets. So the older children in the primary school would brush up on their internet safety and go into the younger year groups and give presentations in front of the class on having a secure password and don't talk to strangers and all of those sorts of things. And it really resonated with her. And for a 5-year-old to come home and tell, you know, professional like myself, probably the best piece of online safety advice I've ever heard, you know, I think it's saying something. And that tells me that that's where it's at. It's education and it's critical thinking so that people can sort the wheat from the chaff themselves. That's my view.
Honestly, that anecdote gave me so much hope, because you know how obsessed I am with that specific topic. I mean, they had people coming back in, and then it resonated with her so much. He told you I can only imagine if that happened in every classroom in the world, how many kids would be able to move forward in a more responsible way. That's awesome. So next we'll go to Mario, and then Natalie, if you have any final thoughts on this question.
I'm going to be brief. It's just on social media more than on other media outlets, but social media, regulating or banning groups, or we have to ask ourselves the question what the purpose is of that. So sometimes it can be, if we want to stop the spread of some really hateful and probably unlawful messaging, then that's fine. But then there are side effects that we need to keep in mind, that not all these people who do spread those messages are going to disappear. The messages don't disappear. The thinking doesn't disappear. So some of them would go to less regulated platforms, obviously, as we all know. There it gets worse, and then from there, the pathway is clear into encrypted messaging, where it's really hard. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't ban certain groups, or shouldn't consider that, but we need to ask ourselves what the purpose is. If we want to keep an eye on some groups, then banning might not be the ideal way forward. And for some groups, there's no other choice. You just have to. You can't just accept certain kinds of expressions. What I find interesting in the recent debate, at least here in Australia, is that, and it's not only an Australian discussion, but that we look at how the big global players work with the algorithms, that we don't understand the algorithms. So it's a bit more subtle than just saying we ban this and that, or we have certain rules that, this group can't be there. But stopping that business model that YouTube is, and, the channeling of creation and cementing of those echo chambers where there is no counterspeak anymore. The algorithms need to be brought into the open, and we need to understand them better. Also, researchers need to understand them better to work with those companies. I doubt that Facebook and Twitter want that kind of stuff on most of it at least, on their platforms, but they need to show more dedication to working with us in law enforcement with their algorithms and making them public, or at least revealing them to some.
Completely agree. So Natalie, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, just kind of one final comment, that I think it's on a really, really small scale of it, but it latches onto a couple of things that have been said, that I think for me, the only way that we're going to get the trust of people any trust in terms of the media is accountability and kind of owning up to mistakes as well. And it's not good enough that when there's out and out lies produced in the media, and there's these incredibly problematic headlines of exactly what Sean was saying, all you need to do is do a quick Google search of headlines for terrorist attacks, and straight away the inflammatory language that's used is an absolute disgrace. And until we start recognizing asking them not to do that is going to be a big ask. I know that, but I think where it has been proven that they are producing lies and that narratives have been false, putting a 2-line apology on page 68 in the bottom corner is not satisfactory. Like, people don't go to that page, they're not going to read that says, oh, we were wrong on this date and we apologize for any inconvenience and harm caused by this. It's just not good enough. And until we have a media who can step up and own the mistakes that they've made, and I said this in my interview about politicians as well, and until we have that system in place, we're not going to be able to control what they say in the future. But I think to be able to have some element of control over what they've said in the past and whether it's factual or not, and get them to own up to it, until that happens, people aren't going to trust what they're saying. And, you know, I'm not saying that they should then trust what they say going forward, but at least it would be one way of providing some form of accountability in the system.
I completely agree. And I think, fortunately, we're beginning to see some, while they might not be doing it explicitly, I think some are doing it implicitly, like MSNBC and CNN to some extent. Some of their anchors and some of their people are like kind of taking, you know, they're being a lot more straight with their language. I remember just having been here in 2016 when we initially were doing the media side of Rantt, when they were afraid to use the word lie. That's just how cowardly they were at the time. But now I think after the insurrection, especially, and after I think what the big shift happened in the media was when they saw that Trump really didn't care that, you know, hundreds of thousands of people were about to die from COVID. That was when I thought that the shift in a lot of the coverage in CNN and MSNBC specifically, and some of the other networks, or among journalists, because once that's happened to people's humanity, and I think from then they were like, wow, he's actually borderline evil. We didn't listen to the people that were telling us he was, but oh wow, that's what's happening. And I think it's something. I think that's one of the positives Trump served, is that he woke people up to recognize that, oh wow, we played this guy's rally every day. It gave him unadulterated airtime, and look at what he's done, you know. And I hope that's the beginning of the process you're referring to. We don't see any of that on right-wing media at all whatsoever, but I see some tiny glimmers of hope that are getting towards what you're saying, but we'll see. But let me fit in one more of the Rantt subscriber questions, and then I have one final one for all of you. So this question is there any data that's to suggest that people growing up in normal religious backgrounds that are not even particularly fundamentalist, are they more likely to go into extremism or less likely? Someone that has that question. And William, looks like you flashed your mic. You want to hop on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've done a bit of research looking at, I didn't actually publish the article, but I wrote it, looking at kind of voting for the radical right amongst Christians in Europe. And what's actually quite interesting is there's this consensus, at least within the literature, and people having run the data. I wouldn't consider myself a very quantitative scholar, but actually being involved in mainstream religion is actually a protective factor against voting for the radical right or these parties, mainly because religions like Christianity, but others as well, promote kind of universal kind of human values. So yeah, I'm trying to remember some of the key concepts as I speak, but that was one of the things that I found quite interesting. I mean, that might be different in the US context, especially amongst white evangelicals, and the connection between the pulpit and congregants within those communities, because there's obviously quite, I guess, what some of my US friends have described as quite kind of a cultic bubble, as it were, within these communities. But at least in the European case, and when it comes to voting, not necessarily demonstrations or, I mean, there's a whole other weird picture going on if you think about religion and right-wing terrorism at the moment, which probably isn't good conversation to end on, but around kind of Satanism and neo-paganism. But yeah, yeah, it's interesting because intuitively you would think that adherence would be more likely, but the data in the European case is that it's a protective factor to voting for the radical right.
That's interesting because, and this person's actually in the UK, so that's actually a good response to her question, because she, where she lives, her name is Katarina, by the way, shout out Katarina. I think Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting to hear about that context there, because in the US it's the exact opposite. Because here the evangelical community was the reason why Trump won, because once he made the Supreme Court pledges, they backed him, and then they continue to back him, and we know all of that. But I won't go too far down that. That's a whole nother. We'll talk for another 30 minutes on that. But anyone have anything else to add on that? Flash your mic. If not, I'll move to my final question. Sean.
Only to say that I completely agree with Will. I think that genuine religion can be a protective factor. We've seen in the UK how a number of right-wing groups have tried to appropriate elements of faith and Christianity for their own ends. I mean, you only need to look at the Celtic or Nordic cross, which has been appropriated by white supremacists and is now synonymous with white pride, as an example of that. And I think even recently, just a couple of weeks ago here in the UK, Paul Golding from the group Britain First was complaining about a painting of Jesus in, I think, St. Albans Cathedral. And he was complaining that Jesus was portrayed as black, and that would just be, he blamed on the typical mainstream liberal elites, etc., etc. When I'm not particularly religious myself, to be perfectly honest, but I certainly don't think that back in the day Jesus had blonde hair, blue eyes, and had Hollywood good looks. Do you know what I mean? So I think that undermines their message quite a bit, and I don't think it has any serious traction amongst genuine religious groups in the UK. And the same goes for all forms of extremism, to be honest with you. Do you know what I mean? Conservative Islam is not an indicator of extremism or terrorism either. When you consider there's, 2 to 3 billion Muslims in the world, but not exactly 2 to 3 billion terrorists. And we've had plenty of prevent-related cases, actually, where a deeper understanding and a richer understanding of faith has been a real protective factor for people espousing all kinds of extremist views, from extreme right wing through to the more Islamist inspired narratives. But I briefly remember one young man was insistent that he wanted to travel to Syria a few years ago. He said it was God's will, and it turned out he had such a small understanding of faith. He was a recent convert to Islam, for instance, but he'd never set foot in a mosque or read the Quran. He was just being fed these different warped interpretations. So by the local Muslim community embracing him and undertaking religious studies, etc., literally a couple of weeks was all it took before he realized that wasn't the right path to go down. So I think if someone is genuinely religious, then they're not going to be violent. That's my 2 cents worth anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, because the perception in the US especially is the opposite, right? So it's really one of those things where it's interesting to see how the religions in the UK are. It seems in our culture there's been a perversion of religion, kind of largely, just especially by the influencers. We have an influencer culture within religion, in which these people, the ones that go to the top of the pulpit, as you've mentioned, are the ones that are tied to conservatism and some of these practices. And then there's also this, as we've seen, QAnon has really kind of taken on an almost religious like. They prey on people who believe, especially evangelicals who believe in this stuff without a lot of concrete evidence. Essentially, I mean, it takes faith. It takes a lot of faith, right, to believe in. I personally believe in God, but I'm not necessarily religious as well. I'm more spiritual, but I have faith, right? And to prey on people's faith in things that they can't see is what we see conspiracy theorists doing. And it's weird. It's really interesting to hear that. I'm gonna go read on this later. I'm interested about how the difference between the religions, Christianity in the US especially, and the evangelical specifically, and what's going on in the UK, because it seems it's been more. It's doing better there than it is here, to say the least, because we've kind of really melded it into this strange. Not everyone, of course, but some are really getting off on perverting it. So that's interesting. But for time's sake, I'm gonna go ahead and jump into my final question. I want to end this on a positive note. I didn't even plan this. I kind of thought of it as we were going, but I want to do another lightning round and ask everybody, what is the just something that makes them hopeful about where we are. We've spent all these interviews talking about what's wrong, the flaws, what's going on with extremists, what radicalized people, what has really, how we're in this really unprecedented state of affairs with technology and radicalization and all these other factors. There were glimmers of hope throughout all our conversations, but I'll just go in descending order from the last interviews again here and ask, what is the thing that makes you most hopeful about the state of the world? It can pertain to extremism or just general, our political status. What is something that gives you hope, Natalie?
At the risk of being uber cheesy, conversations like this, genuinely, the fact that we are having more and more of these conversations, the fact that there is appetite for these conversations, the fact that there is interest in learning more about these forms of extremism, learning about how we can counter it, what our responsibility is as individuals, what the responsibility is of the state, of the local community. I think the fact that the conversations are actually happening ahead of a government telling us, because let's face it, they're not going to do anything until they're told that they need to. The fact that these conversations are happening and people are interested in them, for me, makes me hopeful, because it's a recognition that people have seen that there is an issue and we need to somehow go about trying to solve it. Very
well said. Mario.
Oh. Tough one. What comes to mind is when I interviewed a group of people who would be considered to be far right, they said to me that, they saw themselves as good people. And I'm not saying that everyone who is a right-wing extremist, and they were I wouldn't consider them extremists, but on the far right, not everyone would consider themselves to be good people. But generally speaking, there's a self-perception of trying to do the right thing. No one wants to be seen as being ignorant, not open to conversations. No one wants to shut down conversations, because that's always the other who don't want to engage in conversations. And if we always think that the other doesn't want to engage in conversations, why don't we use that as an argument? Because obviously there's a foundation there that we can utilize to bring people together despite the conflicts, not in order to talk someone out of a certain mindset, but just to start talking to each other. And I think there's a potential there. And I also agree with what's been said before, that we are starting to take right-wing extremism seriously. Trump's gone. There's a new way of talking about the far right, and it's more disconnected from what started the whole countering violent extremism discourse after 9/11 as a focus on jihadist extremism. We are moving away from this. It is becoming a distinct problem that we face. It's recognized as such, and it's approached as such more and more, rather than sort of a false equivalent side issue of other forms of extremism. We focus on the right-wing extremism. That's a good thing.
True. All right, Sean.
My wife often tells me that when it comes to changing the world, we need to start with our own environment. And even if we just make small differences and changes to those close to us and those around us, if everybody did that, then we could make some serious progress. So I get that how sometimes the broader picture can lead to a bit of negativity, but if we focus on those small local steps, I think we can make really good progress. I mean, in mid-July, I'll be getting my second COVID vaccination, and that gives me hope in itself, just vaccinate full stop. But a few days after that, I'll be going to the wedding of a former neo-Nazi. And later in the summer, I'm hopefully going for pints with another former channel referral. And those sorts of interactions, the lives that we can change at a grassroots level, that gives me hope, because ultimately we've spent, the past hour, whatever, talking about hate. And as cheesy as it is, no child is born with hate. It's a learned behavior. And I think that people have the capacity to unlearn it. And so those local experiences give me a lot of hope for the future.
Awesome. Ashton?
Well, nothing about technology gives me hope, so I'm going to move to another area.
This is difficult for you, isn't it?
I don't have any hope in tech at the moment. So I'm going to say I'm coming to the end of my PhD. And those of you that know me will have documented my mental breakdown on Twitter over the past 3 months. The things that make me hopeful are number one, and I think Black Lives Matter had a lot to do with this last year. There's much more of a move to people realizing that white supremacy is an institution and structural issue rather than something that needs to be put with liberal forms of racism like the Klan or the neo-Nazis, which is very much the groups that I spend time looking at. But actually the argument I make is focusing your attention on this as being the epitome of evil ignores the racism in everyday sort of society. And then the other thing as well is I've seen much more of a move to looking at misogyny as a key part of extremism and not having it just as something that's to do with a racial issue now. And I think that gives me hope that we'll be able to tackle much more wider forms of extremism, particularly online, now that misogynistic speech is also being classed as extremism. So yeah, hope, but not in tech.
Awesome. William.
I mean, I've been really encouraged by the amount of global leadership that is going on after the Christchurch terror attacks, and part of the global call that New Zealand's Prime Minister has been kind of spearheading, both with tech companies but also governments. Because I mean, before then it was kind of up to national governments and learning from these different international best cases, but I think that kind of global cooperation is quite key. But also what Sean was saying in terms of everyday individuals being involved in engaging against bad actors. And as a researcher, I always find it you have to kind of practice what you preach, in terms of if you see something wrong going on that might be kind of against the code of conduct of a particular platform, or potentially hate crime or illegal activity, that you just need to kind of act. So it's a real challenge, challenging issue to keep a pace of. But yeah, I think if everyone does their part, then hopefully we'll make the world a better place.
Yeah.
I'm not going to start singing now, but
I always had Michael Jackson just came into my head.
Yeah.
Well, honestly, I'm gonna get cheesy too, and I'm gonna throw one in here as well, because, and I mean it. What really gives me hope is people like you all. You know, I mean, just to be honest, because after interviewing you this past, it's just people who genuinely, this is your life work, right? This is you, and you mean it. You genuinely mean it, and you spend all your time on this. You're obsessives over it. You research it, you put it into practice, and there's just so much cynicism in the world about people of prominence, and everyone thinks oh, well, there's some self-interest, and there must be something where they're doing this for themselves. But after, people like you just debunk all that cynicism and just show that there are, like William said, when you do your part, if everyone does their part, we can do it, and you all are doing your part, and it just shows. And there are so many of you out there like this, and everyone at CARR, and just all the other researchers I've engaged with, and just activists and people that just genuinely care about this and have done it at great personal expense a lot of the time, and are just really dedicated to this cause and trying to make a difference. So just had to slap on the cheese there at the end and just, tell y'all that I love what you do, and I appreciate all of you.
And on behalf of everyone and CARR, we are incredibly grateful for the opportunity that Rantt has given us as well to engage in these fascinating conversations and this live this panel that we're doing now, and for the opportunity for our articles to be shared as well. We do this for exactly as you've just said, to be able to share our knowledge and our research and our interests. our livelihoods, because we never seem to be able to get away from it, with people to be able to make a difference ultimately. So yeah, so on behalf of CARR, thank you very much to yourself, Ahmed, and Rantt for facilitating the debates that we've had.
Of course, thank you. I mean, I appreciate all that all the research, all the insights you've given, all the important, topics that we've covered over the last I think over 3 years now, which is insane. But it's been wonderful, and we're gonna keep doing it, and we're gonna do more cool projects together. And just thank you all for coming here. It's been pretty great to have the whole crew assembled in this way, and great. I'm glad we ended this on a positive note. We're all gonna go out here now and try to be, as William said, we're gonna go try to be the change we want in the world and sing Michael Jackson and just really make sure we've got everybody engaged. So thank you all for being here, and thank you all for watching. Take care.